He buried his mother 6 years ago, closed the casket, signed the papers, and stood there long after everyone else had left, staring at polished wood as if it could answer a question he didn't yet know how to ask. In his world, things were supposed to make sense. Loss had an order, grief had a timeline, and death was final. That belief carried him through the years that followed, through business deals, quiet dinners, and the slow, controlled routine of a man who had learned to live without the one person who raised him. Until one morning, without warning, that certainty cracked. It didn't happen in a courtroom or a hospital or some dramatic setting you'd expect. It happened in his own kitchen, in the kind of ordinary moment most people would forget before the day even ended. A housemaid stood frozen near the counter, her eyes fixed on a portrait that had hung on the wall for years without drawing a second glance. Her hands trembled, her breathing uneven, like someone who had just seen something they couldn't explain. At first, he thought she was about to apologize for breaking something, or maybe confess to a mistake. But instead, she pointed at the portrait and said something that didn't just sound wrong, it felt impossible. "Sir, your mother isn't dead." The words didn't land all at once. They lingered in the air, heavy and out of place, as if the room itself rejected them. He stared at her, waiting for her to correct herself, to laugh nervously and admit she had made a mistake. But she didn't. She stepped closer, her voice quieter now but far more certain. She said she had seen her. Not in a dream, not in a memory that blurred over time. She said she saw her in a place most people spend their lives avoiding, a psychiatric facility, locked doors, controlled access. The kind of place where names are recorded, histories are rewritten, and people can disappear without anyone asking too many questions. She described details no stranger should know. The small scar near the hairline, the way she tilted her head when listening. The silver locket she always wore, even on days when she had no reason to dress up. And then she said something that made it harder to dismiss. She said the woman looked at her, like she had been waiting. Waiting not for help, not for escape, but for someone to finally notice her. For a moment he didn't react, not because he believed her, but because his mind refused to process what he had just heard. This was a woman he had buried, a funeral he had attended, a loss he had already lived through. There were documents, signatures, witnesses. There was closure. And yet, standing in front of him was someone with no reason to lie, describing a reality that shouldn't exist. He could have dismissed her. He could have told her to stop talking, to forget what she thought she saw, and return to work. That would have been the easier path, but something in her voice held him there. Something steady, something that didn't sound like confusion or fear, but certainty. And then, just as the weight of her words began to settle, the sound of footsteps approached. Calm, measured, familiar. Someone else entered the room, someone who had been part of his life long enough to understand exactly what was being said without hearing every word. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask questions. She simply stepped in, took in the scene, and smiled in a way that seemed perfectly normal on the surface. But there are moments when a smile doesn't reach the eyes, when it arrives too quickly, like a response prepared in advance. In that moment he noticed something small, something most people would miss. A flicker. Not fear in the way people imagine it, loud and obvious, but something quieter. A brief hesitation, gone almost as soon as it appeared. That was the moment everything shifted, because this was no longer just about a strange claim from a frightened housemaid. It became something else entirely, a question without an easy answer, a possibility that should not exist, and a realization that if even a part of this was true, then the past 6 years of his life were built on something that wasn't what it seemed. The kind of realization that doesn't just change what you know, it changes who you trust. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The human mind has a way of protecting itself from ideas it cannot immediately accept. It slows things down, questions every detail, searches for flaws in the story before allowing even the smallest piece of it to feel real. And standing there in that kitchen, Whitaker did exactly that. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse Alina of lying. Instead, He did what men like him have trained themselves to do over a lifetime of discipline and decision-making. He analyzed. He replayed her words carefully, stripping away emotion and focusing only on facts. Because if there was even the slightest chance she was telling the truth, then everything he believed about his past, his family, and the woman he had buried 6 years ago needed to be questioned from the ground up. Graham Whitaker was not a man easily shaken. He had built his reputation on precision, on logic, on the ability to stay calm when others reacted. In business, that made him successful. In life, it made him cautious. He didn't jump to conclusions, and he certainly didn't entertain claims that had no evidence to support them. But Alina's words weren't vague. They weren't the kind of thing someone could invent on the spot and hope to get right. She spoke with detail, with consistency, with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from guessing. And that was the problem, because if she wasn't guessing, then she had seen something. And if she had seen something, then the question wasn't whether she was wrong. The question was how something like this could even happen. There were only a few possibilities, and none of them made sense. Was his mother actually alive? It was the kind of question that should have been dismissed instantly, but it refused to leave his mind. If the answer was yes, then it raised something even more unsettling. Who would go to the extent of faking a death so completely that even the closest family member would never suspect it? And more importantly, why? This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be explained away with a simple mistake. This was something deliberate, something planned, something that required time, access, and control. And the deeper he allowed himself to think about it, the more one uncomfortable truth began to surface. If this was real, then it wasn't an accident. It was a decision someone had made. And that's when the focus began to shift, not just toward the situation, but toward the people around him. Vanessa Whitaker, his wife, had been there through everything. Through the illness, through the hospital visits, through the arrangements that followed. She had handled details he never questioned, made decisions he trusted without hesitation. She was composed, thoughtful, always one step ahead when it came to keeping things organized and under control. The kind of partner most people would describe as dependable. But now, in light of what Alina had said, even the smallest moments began to take on a different meaning. The way Vanessa had stepped into the room earlier, the way she had responded so quickly, the subtle shift in her expression that lasted only a second. It wasn't enough to accuse, but it was enough to notice. And then there was Alina, new to the household, unfamiliar with its history, with no reason to involve herself in something this serious unless she truly believed what she was saying. She wasn't calculating. She wasn't trying to convince anyone with clever words or dramatic emotion. If anything, she seemed reluctant, as though she understood the weight of what she was bringing into that room and wished she didn't have to say it at all. That kind of hesitation doesn't come from someone trying to deceive. It comes from someone who knows the truth might cause more harm than silence. And yet, she spoke anyway. So now the situation stood at a crossroads. Three people in one house, connected by a statement that should never have been made. A man who buried his mother, a wife who helped him move on, and a maid who claimed that everything they believed was wrong. Because if Alina was telling the truth, then someone didn't just lie, they rewrote reality. To understand why Alina's words carried so much weight, you have to understand the man standing in that kitchen. Graham Whitaker didn't build his life on emotion or instinct. He built it on structure. Every decision he made, every risk he took was calculated. He came from very little, raised in a modest home by a woman who believed discipline mattered more than comfort. His mother was the kind of person who didn't just give advice, she lived by it. She worked long hours, kept a tight routine, and made sure her son understood that nothing in life was guaranteed unless you earned it. That mindset stayed with him. It shaped the man he became. And over time, it turned him into someone who didn't leave room for uncertainty. Men like Graham don't believe in chaos, they believe in facts. And the fact, as far as he had always known, was that his mother was gone. Her passing had not been dramatic or sudden in the way stories often portray. It was quiet, almost controlled, The result of what he had been told were medical complications that escalated faster than expected. There had been hospital visits, conversations with doctors, and then a conclusion. But even then, there were details that never fully settled in his mind. The casket had remained closed. Access during her final days had been limited. There were moments when he had asked questions, only to be reassured that everything was being handled. At the time, he accepted those answers, because the person giving them was someone he trusted completely. Vanessa Whitaker had been at the center of it all. From the outside, she was everything a partner should be: composed, attentive, always prepared. She handled the hospital arrangements, spoke with the staff, coordinated the funeral, and made sure nothing was left unresolved. In moments when Graham found it difficult to focus, she stepped in without hesitation. It looked like support. It felt like stability. And for years, he never had a reason to question it. But now, standing in that same house where every decision had once seemed so clear, those memories began to shift. Because there is a difference between helping someone through a difficult time and controlling how that time unfolds. She didn't just support Graham's life, she quietly managed it. Not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that made everything appear effortless. Finances, schedules, communication with people outside their immediate circle. Vanessa had a hand in all of it. It wasn't something Graham resisted. In fact, it made his life easier. It allowed him to focus on his work, on expanding his business, on maintaining the order he valued so much. But control, when it goes unnoticed, has a way of becoming invisible. And when it's invisible, it's rarely questioned. Then there was Alina. New to the household, still adjusting to its routines, still learning the patterns of a place where everything seemed to run with quiet precision. She wasn't part of their past. She had no connection to Graham's mother, no involvement in the events of 6 years ago. Which is exactly why her words mattered. She wasn't influenced by memory or emotion tied to the family. She observed. She noticed details others overlooked. The kind of person who remembers faces, small habits, subtle expressions. And when she spoke about the woman she claimed to have seen, she didn't hesitate over the specifics. The scar, the locket, the way she hummed under her breath as if it were something she had done her entire life without thinking. There was no clear reason for Alina to lie. No benefit in creating a story that could easily cost her job, her credibility, and her place in a household she had only just entered. If anything, the risk outweighed any possible gain, and that alone made her claim harder to dismiss. Because when someone with nothing to gain speaks with that level of certainty, it forces a different kind of question. Not whether they should be believed, but whether they've seen something others were never meant to notice. And as Graham stood there, replaying everything he thought he knew about his mother's death, one realization began to take shape. The past he trusted so completely wasn't as solid as he believed. There were gaps, small ones at first, easy to ignore, but now impossible to overlook. And if those gaps were real, then whatever happened 6 years ago hadn't been as straightforward as it seemed. It started as an ordinary morning, the kind that rarely leaves a lasting impression. The house was quiet, structured, predictable, just the way Graham Whitaker preferred it. Routine had always been his way of keeping control, and nothing about that morning suggested it would be any different. Alina moved through the space methodically, focused on her tasks, careful not to disrupt anything. She had only been working there for a short time, but she had already learned that this was a home where everything had its place, and nothing was left to chance. As she worked her way into the main living area, her attention shifted toward the wall where several framed photographs were arranged with deliberate precision. Most were formal, composed images that reflected the life Graham had built. But one portrait stood out. It was older, more personal, less polished. And the moment Alina's eyes settled on it, something changed. She stopped moving completely, as if her body had reacted before her mind could catch up. The cloth in her hand slipped slightly as she stepped closer, her focus narrowing in a way that suggested recognition rather than curiosity. There are moments when people see something familiar and pause, trying to place it. This wasn't that. This was immediate. Her breathing slowed, her expression tightened, and for a brief moment it looked as though she was trying to convince herself she was wrong. But the longer she stared, the harder it became to ignore what she was seeing. By the time Graham entered the room, she hadn't moved. He noticed her standing there, her attention fixed on the portrait, and at first, he assumed she was simply distracted. But then she turned toward him, and the look on her face made it clear this was something else entirely. "Sir, I've seen this woman before." The statement didn't carry hesitation. It wasn't framed as a question or softened with uncertainty. It was direct. Graham's first instinct was to dismiss it. People see familiar faces all the time, especially when looking at older photographs. It was a simple explanation, one that didn't require further thought. He told her it wasn't possible, that she must be mistaken. But Alina didn't step back from what she said. If anything, she became more certain. She pointed again at the portrait, her voice steadier now, as if she understood that what she was saying needed to be precise. She began to describe details, not general similarities or vague impressions, but specific things that didn't leave room for coincidence. The small scar near the hairline, partially hidden but still visible if you knew where to look. The eyes, not just their color but the way they held focus, as though always observing more than they revealed. The silver locket, simple in design but worn consistently, the kind of item people don't replace or forget. And then she mentioned something that caused a shift in the room, something that went beyond physical recognition. She said the woman hummed softly to herself. A quiet, repetitive melody, almost like a habit. The kind of detail no one would notice unless they had been close enough, long enough, to hear it more than once. Graham's expression didn't change immediately, but the certainty he had felt earlier began to weaken. These weren't details someone could easily invent. They required observation, time, proximity. He tried to hold onto logic to maintain the structure he had always relied on, but Alina didn't allow the moment to pass. She took a step forward, her voice firm now, carrying a weight that was difficult to ignore. "Those aren't details you guess, those are details you remember." The room fell quiet after that. Not the kind of silence that comes from calm, but the kind that forms when something has been said that cannot be easily undone. And then, just as Graham began to process what he had heard, the sound of footsteps approached. Vanessa entered the room with the same composed presence she always carried, her expression neutral, her movements controlled. She didn't ask what was happening. She didn't need to. A quick glance at Alina, then at the portrait, was enough for her to understand the situation. Her response came quickly, almost too quickly. She dismissed the statement without giving it space to develop, her tone calm but firm. She suggested Alina was confused, perhaps overwhelmed, and encouraged her to step away and rest. It sounded reasonable, measured, exactly what someone would say to diffuse an uncomfortable situation. But there was something about the timing, about the way she interrupted before Graham could respond, that felt different. She didn't allow questions to form. She didn't entertain the possibility, even briefly. She redirected the moment with precision, guiding it away from uncertainty and back toward control. Alina hesitated, clearly aware that continuing might cause more tension. But the conviction in her expression didn't disappear. She stepped back, not because she had changed her mind, but because she understood she was no longer being allowed to speak. Graham watched the exchange without intervening, his attention shifting between the two women. On the surface, Vanessa's reaction made sense. It aligned with the order he was used to, the clarity he depended on. But something about it didn't sit as easily as it should have. It wasn't what she said. It was how quickly she moved to end the conversation, how little space she gave it to exist. And in that moment, as brief as it was, he noticed something he couldn't ignore. For just a second, Vanessa didn't look calm, she looked afraid. Once the moment in the kitchen passed, the house returned to its usual quiet rhythm, but for Graham Whitaker nothing felt the same. The structure he relied on had been interrupted, and whether he wanted to admit it or not, Alina's words had created a question he couldn't ignore. Doubt doesn't arrive all at once. It starts small, almost unnoticeable, and then it grows each time something doesn't align the way it should. That afternoon, Graham did something he hadn't done in years. He went back to the beginning. He pulled out the documents connected to his mother's death, the ones he had signed without hesitation, the ones he had trusted completely at the time. The death certificate was exactly where it should be, preserved, official, final. At first glance, it confirmed everything he already knew, but Graham didn't stop at first glance. He studied it the way he would study a contract, carefully, methodically, paying attention to details most people would overlook. That's when he saw it. The signature. It matched in style but not in precision. Subtle differences, the kind that wouldn't stand out unless you were looking for them. The more he compared it to other verified documents, the more the inconsistency became difficult to dismiss. It wasn't enough to prove anything on its own, but it was enough to raise concern. And once that concern was there, it pushed him further. He moved on to the hospital records, expecting clarity, expecting something that would reinforce the version of events he had accepted for 6 years. Instead, he found gaps, missing entries, incomplete logs. There were references to treatments, but no detailed records supporting them. Dates that should have been accounted for simply weren't. For a man like Graham, missing information wasn't a minor issue. It was a sign of interference. Systems don't fail in isolated ways without reason, especially not in places where documentation is critical. And the more he looked, the clearer it became that something had been altered, removed, or hidden. The certainty he once had began to shift into something else entirely. Not panic, not fear, but focus. The kind of focus that comes when a problem presents itself and demands to be solved. He didn't confront Vanessa. He didn't question Alina again. Instead, he made a decision. If the answers weren't in the records he had, then he needed to go to the source. The psychiatric facility Alina had mentioned wasn't easy to access. It wasn't the kind of place that welcomed unexpected visitors or answered questions without hesitation. When Graham arrived, he was met with polite resistance. Staff members were professional, careful with their words, offering general responses without providing anything specific. They asked for names, identification, authorization, and when he pushed further, the tone shifted slightly. Not confrontational, but controlled. Records, they explained, were restricted. Patient information was confidential. There were procedures that had to be followed. On the surface, it all sounded reasonable. But there was something underneath it, something that didn't match the situation. A level of caution that felt less about policy and more about prevention. As he moved through the facility, escorted but closely observed, Graham became aware of the environment in a way he hadn't expected. The doors were secured, opening and closing with deliberate timing. The hallways were quiet, not empty, but controlled, as though every movement was monitored. Conversations were brief, voices kept low. And then there was the presence of security, not overtly aggressive but constant, watching, not just the patients but him. It created a pressure that wasn't easy to explain, the sense that he was somewhere he wasn't meant to explore too deeply. But by that point, turning back wasn't an option. He had come too far to leave with the same questions he arrived with. It happened quickly, almost without warning. As he was being guided past one of the secured sections, his attention shifted. At first, it was just movement, someone seated near a window, partially turned away. But something about the posture, the stillness, made him look again. And then he saw her. Not clearly, not in the way you recognize someone instantly, but enough to create a reaction he couldn't control. She was older, more fragile than he remembered, her presence quieter, diminished in a way that suggested years of isolation. But there was something familiar, something that didn't align with the idea that this was a stranger. He stopped walking. The staff member beside him noticed immediately, attempting to redirect his attention, but it was too late. Graham's focus was fixed. The woman shifted slightly, her face turning just enough for him to see more. Not everything, not with certainty, but enough to make doubt impossible to ignore. He wanted to step closer, to confirm what he was seeing, but before he could move, she looked away again, as though the moment had passed before it could fully form. And then something unexpected happened. Without thinking, almost instinctively, Graham spoke. Not loudly, not even clearly, just a few notes of a melody he hadn't realized he still remembered. The same quiet lullaby Alina had described. For a second, nothing changed. And then the woman paused. Her posture stiffened slightly, her head tilting in a way that felt familiar. Slowly, she turned back, her eyes searching, unfocused at first, and then narrowing as if trying to recognize something just out of reach. She didn't speak. She didn't move closer. But in that moment, there was a connection. Brief, fragile, but real. She didn't recognize him until she heard the lullaby. The moment didn't last. Staff stepped in quickly, their tone firmer now, guiding Graham away before he could say anything else. They dismissed it as coincidence, as confusion, suggesting that patients often react to familiar sounds without understanding why. It was a reasonable explanation, one that could easily be accepted under normal circumstances, but nothing about this felt normal anymore. As he was led back through the facility, away from the secured section, his phone began to vibrate. Once, then again and again. Vanessa, calling repeatedly. The timing wasn't lost on him. She hadn't known where he was, at least not officially, and yet her calls came at the exact moment he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. By the time he stepped outside, the pressure had shifted into something clearer. This wasn't just about uncertainty anymore. It was about resistance, about barriers that appeared too quickly, explanations that came too easily, and reactions that didn't match the situation. As he looked back at the building, one thought settled in with a certainty he could no longer ignore. Someone didn't want him there. By the time Graham Whitaker drove back home, the silence in the car felt heavier than anything he had experienced in years. Not because he lacked answers, but because the answers he was beginning to piece together didn't fit into the life he had built. For a man who depended on clarity, on structure, on facts that could be verified and trusted, this situation forced him into unfamiliar territory. But unlike the uncertainty he felt earlier, this was different. This was direction. Every inconsistency, every missing record, every reaction that didn't align was starting to form a pattern. And patterns, unlike emotions, could be followed. They could be tested. And eventually, they could reveal the truth. When he walked into the house, everything appeared unchanged. The same arrangement, the same quiet order, the same sense of control that had defined his environment for years. Vanessa was there, exactly where he expected her to be, composed, steady, her expression neutral in a way that suggested nothing had shifted. But Graham wasn't seeing the same image anymore. He wasn't responding as a husband returning home. He was observing, calculating, measuring every detail the same way he would approach a negotiation where the stakes were high and the margin for error didn't exist. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush the moment. Instead, he gave it space, allowing the weight of what he knew to settle before he spoke. He started with questions. Simple ones at first, the kind that would seem harmless on the surface, about the hospital, about the arrangements made 6 years ago, about the decisions that were handled during a time when he trusted her completely. Vanessa answered without hesitation, her tone consistent, her responses aligned with the version of events he had always believed. But now, those answers didn't hold the same strength, because Graham wasn't listening for reassurance anymore. He was listening for precision. And when precision is missing, even in small ways, it becomes impossible to ignore. So he changed his approach. He introduced specifics, the signature that didn't match, the missing medical logs, the restricted access at the facility. And then finally, he mentioned what mattered most. The woman he saw, he didn't describe her in detail. He didn't need to. The moment he said it, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. Vanessa didn't react in a way that would immediately confirm anything. But there was a pause, a brief interruption in the rhythm she had maintained throughout the conversation. And for Graham, that was enough. Because in a situation like this, hesitation speaks louder than denial. The truth didn't come all at once. It revealed itself in layers, each one harder to dismiss than the last. Financial records he had never reviewed closely enough. Transfers that didn't align with standard expenses. Payments connected to institutions he had no reason to question at the time. Then came the medical side. Documents that showed authorization, approvals that required a signature, his signature, or at least something designed to resemble it. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. This wasn't an isolated decision. It was a coordinated effort, planned, executed, maintained over years without a single visible crack. Vanessa didn't interrupt him this time. She didn't try to redirect the conversation or dismiss the details the way she had earlier with Alina. She stood there, listening, her expression controlled but no longer untouched. Because at this point, denial required more effort than silence. And silence, in moments like this, often says everything that needs to be understood. When Graham finally stopped speaking, the room felt different. Not tense in the way arguments usually are, but settled, as though the outcome had already been decided before either of them acknowledged it. "You didn't just lie to me." His voice was steady, not raised, not emotional in the way most people would expect, but there was something beneath it, something controlled but undeniable. "You buried my mother alive." The words didn't need emphasis. They carried their own weight. And for the first time since the conversation began, Vanessa didn't respond immediately, because there was no version of the truth left that could undo what had already been uncovered. What followed wasn't a dramatic confession. It didn't come with sudden emotion or visible collapse. Instead, it came through what was already there, the evidence, the structure of a plan that had been built carefully enough to last for years. Control of wealth had been the foundation. With Graham's mother removed, access to inheritance became direct, simplified, easier to manage without interference. But it didn't stop there. Control extends beyond finances. It shapes decisions, influences direction, determines outcomes. And with that control, Vanessa positioned herself not just as a partner in Graham's life, but as the one guiding it. Every document, every transfer, every authorization pointed back to the same conclusion. This wasn't about a single moment of deception. It was about maintaining power over time, ensuring that nothing disrupted the version of reality she had created. And for 6 years, it worked. Because the one person who would have questioned it the most was never given the chance. For a moment, it felt like everything had already been revealed. The deception, the control, the years built on something that no longer held the same meaning. But the truth, as Graham Whitaker was beginning to understand, rarely ends where you expect it to. Because even after uncovering what had been done, there was still one question that hadn't been fully answered. Not how it happened and not why, but something far more personal: whether his mother had known. Whether, in all those years, she had been aware of what was taken from her, and whether she had tried, in any way, to reach him. The answer came not through a confession, but through the details he had almost overlooked. The same details Alina had noticed without hesitation. The silver locket she always wore. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a personal item, something tied to memory rather than meaning. But when Graham finally examined it closely, he realized it wasn't just an accessory. Inside, hidden in a way that required intention to discover, was something small but deliberate: a photograph. Not recent, not staged, but carefully placed. It was him. Younger, unaware, taken long before everything changed. It wasn't there for sentiment. It was there as a reminder, a connection she refused to lose, even in a place designed to erase identity. And then there was the song, the quiet lullaby Alina had described, the same one Graham had repeated without thinking when he saw her at the facility. It wasn't random. It wasn't just a habit carried over from the past. It was a signal, something simple enough to go unnoticed by those who didn't understand it, but specific enough to reach the one person it was meant for. A way of holding onto recognition when everything else had been taken. The realization settled in slowly, but once it did, it couldn't be ignored. She hadn't been waiting without purpose. She had been trying, in the only ways she could, to leave something behind that would eventually lead back to her. When Graham returned to the facility, the environment felt the same, but his purpose had changed. This time he wasn't searching for confirmation. He already had it. What he needed now was something else: closure. Not the kind that comes from answers, but the kind that comes from connection. When he saw her again, the distance between them felt smaller, even though nothing about the setting had changed. She looked the same as before, fragile, quiet, her presence shaped by years that had taken more than they should have. But this time when he spoke, he didn't hesitate. He repeated the melody, slower now, clearer, allowing it to carry through the silence. At first there was no reaction. Then gradually something shifted. Her expression changed, not dramatically but enough to be noticed. Her eyes focused, searching, as if something buried deep was trying to find its way back. It wasn't immediate recognition, not in the way people imagine it, but it was something real, something that existed beneath everything that had been done to keep her disconnected. And in that moment, brief as it was, there was understanding. Not spoken, not fully formed, but present, enough to confirm what he already knew. She wasn't gone, she was silenced. The words didn't come from anger or accusation. They came from clarity, from the realization that what had been taken wasn't just time or freedom, but presence. A life removed without acknowledgement, a voice suppressed without resistance. And standing there, Graham understood something that extended beyond his own situation. Trust isn't just about believing what someone tells you. It's about understanding how much of your reality is shaped by the people you allow closest to you. Because control doesn't always appear as force. Sometimes it's quiet, structured, hidden in decisions you never think to question. As he left the facility, the weight of everything remained, but it was different now. Not unresolved, not uncertain, but defined. The truth had been uncovered, the connection restored, even if only in fragments. And yet one thought stayed with him, something that couldn't be ignored or easily answered. Because if something like this could exist undetected for so long, if reality itself could be shaped and maintained without question, then it raised a final, unavoidable question. Could you tell if someone was controlling your reality? By the time you reach the end of a story like this, the details stay with you, not just because of what happened, but because of what it represents. Graham Whitaker trusted the structure of his life. He trusted the people closest to him. And for years, nothing gave him a reason to question that trust. Until one moment, one statement, changed everything he thought he knew. And that's what makes this story difficult to ignore. It forces you to look beyond the surface, beyond what appears stable, and consider how much of reality is shaped by the people we rely on every day. Because sometimes, the truth isn't hidden far away. Sometimes it's right there, carefully managed, waiting for the right moment to be seen. So now the question turns to you. What would you have done in Graham's position? Would you have dismissed Alina's words and moved on? Or would you have followed that doubt, even if it meant uncovering something you weren't prepared to face? Did you suspect Vanessa early? Or did the truth catch you off guard as the pieces came together? And more importantly, have you ever trusted someone, completely and without hesitation, only to realize later that there was more beneath the surface than you ever imagined? Because stories like this don't just end when the truth is revealed. They stay with you, shaping the way you see trust, control, and the people around you. If this story made you think, there's more like it waiting for you.